The wind screamed across the frozen world of Kepler 442b like an angry beast. Kim Jun pulled his thermal suit tighter around his body as he crouched inside the damaged emergency pod. The metal walls shook with each gust of wind that slammed against them. Ice crystals had formed on the inside of his visor, making it hard to see clearly. 3 days had passed since his transport ship crashed during what should have been a simple supply run to the outer colonies. The ship had been carrying medical supplies and food to the research station on the edge of human space. Everything had gone wrong when they hit an unexpected ion storm. The last thing June remembered was the captain screaming orders before the ship broke apart in the atmosphere. He was lucky to be alive. The emergency pod had deployed automatically and crashed into a rocky valley surrounded by tall cliffs. The beacon should have been sending out distress signals, but the display showed nothing but static. Either the transmitter was broken, or the storm was blocking all communications. Either way, he was completely alone on a world where the temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero every night. The heating unit had failed on the second day. June had tried everything he could think of to fix it, but the power cell was damaged beyond repair. Now he had to rely on his body heat and the insulation in his suit to stay warm. He rationed his food carefully, eating only small portions of the protein bars in his emergency kit. The water recycler still worked, which meant he would not die of thirst, but the cold was slowly draining his strength. June had always been proud of his ability to stay calm under pressure. As a supply officer in the colonial fleet, he had seen plenty of dangerous situations. Pirates, equipment failures, and hostile weather were all part of the job. But this was different. He was completely cut off from any help, and every hour that passed made rescue less likely. On the 4th morning, something changed. The wind had died down during the night, and a strange quiet had settled over the valley. June was checking his remaining supplies when he heard something that did not belong in the frozen wilderness. It was a high-pitched sound, almost like the chirping of birds, but more musical and complex. The sound came from somewhere outside the pod. June listened carefully, trying to figure out what could be making such noise on a world that seemed completely lifeless. The chirping continued, sometimes getting louder and sometimes fading away. There was something desperate about it, like a cry for help. June knew he should stay inside where it was relatively warm. Going outside would use up precious body heat and could be dangerous if the weather turned bad again. But the sound kept pulling at him. In all his training, he had been taught that humans had a responsibility to help others when they could. That training had not covered alien life forms, but the principle was the same. He sealed his helmet and checked the power levels in his suit. The battery would give him about 2 hours of heating if he was careful. That should be enough time to investigate the source of the sound and get back to safety. He opened the pod door and stepped out into the bitter cold. The landscape around him was like something from a nightmare. Jagged rocks covered in ice stretched in every direction. The sky was a pale gray color that seemed to press down on everything below it. In the distance, he could see the mountains that ringed the valley, their peaks lost in low clouds. The chirping sound was coming from a cluster of large rocks about 50 meters away. June moved carefully across the uneven ground, testing each step to make sure the ice would hold his weight. The sound grew louder as he got closer, and he could tell there was more than one voice involved. Whatever was making the noise, there were several of them. When he reached the rocks, June found a narrow gap that led into a shallow cave. The chirping was definitely coming from inside. He activated the light on his helmet and peered into the darkness. What he saw made him stop breathing for a moment. 3 small creatures huddled together against the back wall of the cave. They were unlike anything he had ever seen or studied. Each one was about the size of a house cat, with pale white skin that seemed to glow with its own inner light. Their bodies were slender and graceful, with 4 delicate limbs that ended in tiny hands with long fingers. But it was their eyes that captured his attention. They were large and dark, reflecting the light from his helmet like polished glass. The creatures looked at him without fear, as if they somehow understood that he was not a threat. Their chirping became softer and more melodic when they saw him, almost like they were trying to communicate. June could see that the creatures were in bad shape. They were shivering constantly, and their breathing was shallow and rapid. The cave offered some protection from the wind, but it was still freezing cold inside. Without help, these small beings would not survive much longer. He had no idea what they were or where they had come from. The planet was supposed to be lifeless according to all the surveys. These creatures could be dangerous or they might carry diseases that could kill him. Every regulation and safety protocol told him to observe from a distance and report his findings to the proper authorities. But as he watched them huddle together for warmth, June knew he could not just walk away. They were clearly intelligent and they were suffering. The same instinct that had made him investigate the sound in the first place now told him that he had to do something to help them. The practical part of his mind pointed out all the reasons why this was a bad idea. He barely had enough resources to keep himself alive. Taking care of 3 alien creatures would use up his food and water faster. It would also mean sharing the limited warmth in his shelter. Despite all the logical arguments against it, June made his decision. He could not let these creatures die when he had the power to save them. Very slowly and gently he reached into the cave and picked up the first creature. It did not resist, instead pressing against his warm gloves with obvious relief. The other 2 creatures seemed to understand what was happening. They moved closer to him, their chirping becoming more urgent. Within minutes, June had gathered all 3 of them in his arms. They were surprisingly light and their skin felt smooth and warm despite the cold. The journey back to his emergency pod was the longest 50 meters of his life. The creatures stayed quiet during the trip, as if they understood the need for caution. When they reached the shelter, June carefully brought them inside and sealed the door behind them. The pod suddenly felt much more crowded, but also somehow more alive. The creatures looked around with obvious curiosity, their large eyes taking in every detail of their new environment. June could see intelligence in those eyes, and something that looked almost like gratitude. He had just made first contact with an unknown alien species, and he had no idea what would happen next. Inside the emergency pod, June carefully set the 3 creatures down on his sleeping bag. They immediately pressed together for warmth, their soft chirping filling the small space with gentle sounds. The pod felt different now, less empty and cold. The presence of other living beings made the metal walls seem less like a prison and more like a home. The creatures looked around with wide, curious eyes. Their pale skin seemed to glow more brightly in the artificial light of the pod. June watched them carefully, trying to understand what they needed. They were clearly cold and weak, but they did not seem afraid of him. If anything, they appeared grateful for the rescue. June knew he had to act quickly. The creatures were shivering badly and their breathing was still too fast. He needed to warm them up before anything else. The heating unit was broken, but his suit still had some power left in its heating elements. He carefully removed his outer jacket and wrapped it around the 3 small beings. The effect was immediate. Their shivering slowed down, and their chirping became softer and more relaxed. They snuggled deeper into the warm fabric, their large eyes slowly closing. For the first time since he had found them, June felt a spark of hope that they might survive. But keeping them warm was only the first challenge. They would need food and water, and June was not sure what they could safely eat. His emergency supplies were designed for human needs, not for unknown alien creatures. He would have to experiment carefully and hope for the best. He opened one of his protein bars and broke off a small piece. The creatures watched him with interest as he offered it to the closest one. The small being sniffed at the food carefully, then took a tiny bite. Its eyes widened with what looked like surprise, and it quickly ate the rest of the piece. The other 2 creatures became excited when they saw their companion eating. They made soft chirping sounds and reached toward June with their delicate hands. He gave them each a small piece of the protein bar, and they ate eagerly. Whatever these creatures were, they could digest human food. Encouraged by this success, June tried giving them some water. They drank carefully at first, then more eagerly as they realized it was safe. Their whole bodies seemed to relax as they ate and drank. The desperate edge to their chirping disappeared, replaced by sounds that almost seemed like contentment. As the hours passed, June began to notice more details about his unexpected guests. Their skin was not just pale, but actually translucent in places. He could see what looked like a network of fine vessels beneath the surface, carrying a fluid that glowed with a soft blue light. Their hands were incredibly delicate, with 6 fingers each that moved with precise control. Most remarkable of all were their eyes. They were not just large, but seemed to hold real intelligence behind them. The creatures watched everything June did with obvious interest. When he moved around the pod, their heads followed him. When he spoke, they tilted their heads as if trying to understand his words. By the end of the first day together, something amazing happened. The smallest of the three creatures made a sound that was almost like an attempt to copy human speech. It was just a soft syllable, but it was clearly different from their normal chirping. The other two immediately tried to make similar sounds. June was fascinated. These creatures were not just intelligent, they were trying to communicate with him. He began speaking to them in simple words, pointing to objects and naming them. The creatures listened carefully and tried to repeat the sounds. Their attempts were not very successful, but the effort was clear. Over the next day, June developed a routine. He shared his food and water with the creatures at regular intervals. He kept them warm by letting them sleep against his body when he rested. He talked to them constantly, teaching them simple words and trying to learn their chirping language in return. The creatures seemed to understand that they needed names. June decided to call them Hana, Dal, and Buell after Korean words for one, moon, and star. They learned to respond when he called their names, and they even seemed to understand which name belonged to which creature. Hana was the smallest and most vocal of the three. She was always the first to try new foods and the quickest to learn new sounds. Dal was the calmest, often sitting quietly and watching everything with those large, intelligent eyes. Bile was the most affectionate, always trying to stay close to June and making soft chirping sounds when he petted her gently. As they grew stronger, the creatures became more active. They explored every corner of the small pod, examining equipment with careful touches of their delicate fingers. They learned to recognize which items were important and which ones they should not touch. They even seemed to understand that the emergency beacon was supposed to bring help, but the beacon remained silent. 4 days had passed since the crash, and June was beginning to worry that no rescue would come. His food supplies were running lower, especially since he was sharing with 3 additional mouths. The power in his suit was almost gone, and the temperature outside continued to drop. The creatures seemed to sense his worry. They stayed closer to him and made softer, more comforting sounds. Sometimes they would gently touch his hands with their small fingers as if trying to reassure him. Their presence made the situation easier to bear, but it also added to his responsibility. On the 5th night, as June lay with the 3 creatures curled against his chest for warmth, he made a decision. Even if rescue never came, he was glad he had saved them. They had brought something precious into his life during the darkest time he had ever experienced. They had shown him that intelligence and kindness could exist in forms he had never imagined. The creatures seemed to sleep peacefully, their soft breathing creating tiny clouds in the cold air of the pod. Their pale skin still glowed with that inner light, making them look like small angels in the darkness. June closed his eyes and tried to rest, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges. He had no way of knowing that help was already on the way, or that his simple act of kindness had started something that would change the future of 2 entire species. All he knew was that he had found 3 small lives worth protecting, and he would do everything in his power to keep them safe. The bond between human and alien was growing stronger with each passing hour, creating connections that neither species had ever experienced before. On the 6th morning, something wonderful happened. The emergency beacon suddenly came to life with a series of beeps that made June jump with excitement. The small screen showed an incoming signal, weak but definitely there. Someone was trying to reach him. June quickly activated the communication system and spoke into the microphone. His voice was hoarse from days of cold air, but he managed to get his message across. He gave his identification number, his location as best he could determine, and confirmed that he was alive and in need of rescue. The response came back filled with static, but he could make out the important parts. A rescue ship called Soul's Pride was already on its way to his location. They had been searching for survivors from the transport crash for several days. The pilot estimated they would reach him in about 18 hours. The 3 creatures seemed to sense his excitement. They chirped more loudly and moved around the pod with obvious energy. Hana even tried to make sounds that seemed like celebration, though they came out as musical trills rather than words. Dal and Buell pressed close to June, as if they wanted to share in his happiness. But as the day went on, June began to worry about what would happen when the rescue ship arrived. The creatures had become completely attached to him. They followed him everywhere in the small pod and became upset when he moved too far away from them. They had learned to eat from his hand and trusted him completely. How could he explain to the rescue team that he had made contact with unknown alien life forms? More importantly, what would happen to Hana, Dal, and Buell When the authorities found out about them, would they be taken away for study? Would they be separated from him? The thought of losing them made his chest feel tight with worry. The creatures seemed to understand that something was changing. They stayed closer to him than usual and made soft, questioning sounds when they looked at him. Beale kept touching his hand gently, as if she was trying to comfort him. Dal watched the communication equipment with those large, intelligent eyes, as if he understood that it would bring changes to their small family. June made a decision. He would tell the rescue team about the creatures immediately. He would not try to hide them or pretend they did not exist. These beings deserved to be treated with respect and kindness, not kept as secrets. He hoped that the people who came to rescue him would understand how special Hannah, Dal, and Buell were. As evening approached, June prepared for the arrival of the rescue ship. He organized his few belongings and made sure the creatures had eaten well. He practiced what he would say to explain the situation. Most importantly, he spent time with each of the creatures, trying to let them know that no matter what happened, he cared about them. The creatures seemed to sense that their time together in the pod was coming to an end. They stayed pressed against him throughout the night, making soft sounds that seemed almost like goodbye songs. Their pale skin glowed more brightly than usual, as if their emotions were affecting the light they produced. When morning came, June could see lights in the sky. The rescue ship appeared as a bright point that grew larger as it approached. Soon he could make out the shape of a medium-sized vessel with the markings of the colonial fleet. His heart pounded, with relief and nervousness as the ship settled down near his emergency pod. The creatures watched through the small window as two figures in environmental suits approached the pod. They did not seem afraid, but they moved closer to June and made quiet chirping sounds. Hannah reached up and touched his face gently with one small hand, as if she was trying to tell him something important. A voice came through the communication system, clear and strong. The speaker identified himself as Chief Pilot Park Minho of the Soul's Pride. With him was Dr. Lee Yuna, a xenobiologist who had come along in case they found anything unusual during the rescue mission. June almost laughed at how right they were about finding something unusual. The pod door opened and cold air rushed in. The two rescuers stepped inside, their helmets reflecting the light from the creature's glowing skin. There was a moment of complete silence as they stared at the three small beings pressed against June's side. Dr. Yuna was the first to speak. Her voice was filled with wonder and excitement. She had never seen anything like the creatures before. They were clearly not from any known species in the galactic database. She immediately began setting up scanning equipment to learn more about them. Pilot Minho was more practical. He wanted to know where the creatures had come from and whether they posed any danger. June quickly explained how he had found them dying in the cave and decided to save them. He told the story of how they had learned to trust him and how intelligent they seemed to be. The creatures watched the two newcomers carefully. They stayed close to June but did not seem frightened. When Dr. Yuna spoke to them in a gentle voice, they responded with soft chirping sounds. When she slowly reached out her hand, Hannah sniffed at it carefully before allowing the contact. Dr. Yuna's equipment revealed amazing things about the creatures. Their body temperature was much lower than human normal, but their metabolism was incredibly efficient. Their brains showed activity patterns that suggested high intelligence and complex emotional responses. Most surprising of all, they seemed to have formed strong chemical bonds with June that were similar to family attachments in social animals. The decision was made to bring all four survivors back to the rescue ship immediately. The creatures would need special care during the journey, and Dr. Yuna wanted to run more detailed scans in the ship's medical bay. But when the time came to move them, a problem arose. The creatures refused to be separated from June. Whenever someone tried to carry them away from him, they became distressed and stopped eating. They would only calm down when they could see him and touch him. It became clear that their bond with the human was stronger than anyone had expected. Dr. Yuna found this both fascinating and concerning. The creatures had clearly imprinted on June as their primary caregiver and protector. This was not unusual behavior for young animals, but these were obviously intelligent, beings who should have been able to understand that the other humans were trying to help them. The solution was to keep June with the creatures at all times during the journey back to the station. He would stay in the medical bay while Dr. Yuna conducted her studies. The creatures seemed to accept this arrangement. especially when they realized that June was not going to leave them. As the soul's pride lifted off from the frozen planet, June looked down at the place where his life had changed forever. The rocky valley where he had crashed looked small and empty from above. It was hard to believe that such an important discovery had happened in such a desolate place. The three creatures pressed against the window, watching their world disappear below them. They made soft sounds that seemed sad but not frightened. They seemed to understand that they were going somewhere new, and as long as June was with them, they were ready for whatever came next. The rescue that June had hoped for had finally arrived, but it was bringing complications he had never imagined. The journey to Kepler Station took 3 days, and during that time Dr. Yuna made discoveries that changed everything humans thought they knew about alien life. The three creatures were not just intelligent animals. They were something much more remarkable. Her scanner showed that their brains were incredibly complex, with neural pathways that seemed to process information in ways completely different from human minds. Their bodies were a mix of biological and crystalline structures that could store and transmit energy in patterns that looked almost like technology. Most amazing of all, they seemed to be able to communicate with each other without making any sounds. Dr. Yuna watched through her instruments as the creatures would suddenly all turn their heads in the same direction, or start moving together without any visible signal passing between them. When she asked June about this, he realized he had seen the same behavior many times, but had not understood what it meant. The creatures also continued to learn human words at an incredible speed. By the end of the first day on the ship, they could say simple words like hello, food, water, and thank you. Their pronunciation was musical and strange, but clearly understandable. They seemed especially excited when they learned June's name and would repeat it often while looking at him with affection. But the most important discovery came when Dr. Yuna tried to take blood samples for analysis. The moment she approached one of the creatures with a medical scanner, all three of them became extremely upset. They made loud, distressed sounds and tried to hide behind June. Nothing could calm them down until he held them and spoke to them gently. Dr. Yuna realized that the creatures were not just attached to June emotionally. Their brain scans showed that being near him actually changed their body chemistry in positive ways. When he was close, their stress hormones dropped and their healing processes worked faster. When he moved away, even for short periods, their health readings showed signs of distress. This created a serious problem. The creatures clearly needed June to stay healthy, but he was just a supply officer with no training in xenobiology or first contact procedures. When they reached Kepler Station, there would be questions from senior officers and scientists who might want to separate the creatures for detailed study. Captain Osulki was waiting when the Soul's Pride docked at Kepler Station. She was a careful and experienced officer who had dealt with many unusual situations during her career. But she had never faced anything like 3 alien creatures who had bonded with a human crew member. The creatures seemed to understand that they were somewhere important. They stayed very close to June as the group moved through the station corridors, looking around with wide eyes at the lights and sounds of human technology. Other crew members stopped to stare at the strange procession, but the creatures paid no attention to anyone except their human protector. In the station medical bay, Dr. Yuna continued her studies with help from the station's more advanced equipment. The results were even more surprising than her earlier scans. The creatures appeared to be juveniles of a species that was far more advanced than humans had imagined possible. Their cellular structure suggested they could live for hundreds of years. Their brain capacity indicated intelligence levels that might eventually surpass human abilities. Most importantly, their bodies seemed designed for space travel, with built-in radiation resistance and the ability to survive in low-oxygen environments. But where had they come from? The planet where June found them showed no signs of advanced civilization. There were no cities, no technology, and no evidence that intelligent beings had ever lived there. The creatures themselves could not yet explain their origins, though they seemed to understand the questions when asked. The answer came on the 4th day after their arrival at the station. Long-range sensors detected something approaching the system from deep space. It was large, moving fast, and definitely artificial. As it came closer, the sensors revealed a ship unlike anything in human records. The vessel was beautiful and alien, shaped like a complex crystal flower with sections that seemed to pulse with internal light. It was at least 1 kilometer long and appeared to be made from the same translucent material as the creature's skin. When it reached the edge of the system, it stopped and began transmitting signals. The signals were not radio waves or any other form of communication that humans understood. Instead, they seemed to be complex patterns of harmonics that resonated through space itself. The station's communication officers worked frantically to decode the messages, but made no progress until someone had an idea. Communications Officer Nam Teho brought a recording of the alien signals down to the medical bay, where the three creatures were staying with June. The moment they heard the sounds, all three creatures became extremely excited. They began making their own chirping and singing sounds, but much more complex than anything they had produced before. Dr. Yuna realized that the creatures were translating. They understood the signals from the alien ship and were trying to respond. Through careful work with simple questions and gestures, she began to understand what the creatures were telling them. The ship belonged to their people, who called themselves the Luminari. They had been searching for the three young ones for many weeks after their smaller ship had crashed on the frozen planet. The adult Luminari were relieved to know that their children were safe, but they were also concerned about their condition. Through the creatures serving as translators, the humans learned that the three juveniles had been changed by their experience. They were supposed to develop as part of a group consciousness, gradually joining with the mental patterns of their elders. Instead, they had formed individual personalities and emotional bonds that were completely unknown in Luminari society. Captain Oseilki faced an impossible decision. The alien ship was clearly powerful enough to take the creatures by force if necessary, but the creatures themselves seemed terrified at the idea of being separated from June. They had found something with the human that their own people could not provide. Dr. Yuna suggested a meeting between representatives of both species to discuss the situation. The Luminari agreed, and preparations began for first contact between humanity and one of the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy. But as the meeting time approached, it became clear that this would not be a simple diplomatic exchange. The three creatures had become something new, caught between two worlds and two very different ways of understanding consciousness and identity. The bond between June and the creatures had created a situation that neither species had ever encountered before. The future of human-Luminari relations would depend on finding a solution that honored both the advanced wisdom of the Luminari and the simple human capacity for love and individual connection. As the alien ship moved closer to the station, everyone waited to see what would happen when two completely different ideas about life and consciousness finally met face to face. The meeting took place in the station's main conference room, which had been specially prepared for first contact with an alien species. The lighting was adjusted to be comfortable for both humans and Luminari, and translation equipment stood ready, even though the three creatures would be doing most of the communication work. Elder Zarin arrived in a shuttle that seemed to be grown rather than built, its crystalline walls flowing like liquid as it docked with the station. When she stepped into the conference room, everyone present felt a sense of awe. She was nearly 2 meters tall, with the same translucent skin as the creatures but marked with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change in the light. Her presence filled the room with a feeling of ancient wisdom and calm authority. When she spoke, her voice was like music, creating harmonics that seemed to resonate in the bones of everyone who heard her. The three creatures immediately responded to her with complex songs of their own, but they stayed close to June throughout the exchange. Through the translation work of Hana, Tal and Buell, Elder Zarin explained the situation from the Luminari perspective. The three young ones had been part of a research expedition studying primitive worlds when their ship crashed. All the adult crew members had died in the accident, leaving the juveniles alone on a hostile planet. Under normal circumstances, young Luminari developed by gradually joining the group consciousness of their people. They learned to think and feel as part of a larger whole, sharing thoughts and emotions with others of their kind. Individual personality was considered a temporary stage that juveniles grew out of as they matured. But June's rescue had interrupted this natural process. The creatures had formed individual identities based partly on human behavioral patterns. They had learned to think of themselves as separate beings with their own wants and needs. From the Luminari perspective, this was like a form of mental illness that prevented proper development. Elder Zarin was grateful that the human had saved the young ones from death, but she was deeply concerned about their current condition. They could not be properly integrated into Luminari society as they were. Yet they were clearly thriving in ways that challenged everything the Luminari understood about healthy development. Captain O'Silky listened carefully to the translation, then asked the question that everyone was thinking. What did Elder Zarin want to do about the situation? Would she try to take the creatures back to their home world for treatment? Would she accept that they had been permanently changed by their experience with humans? The answer was complex and unexpected. Elder Zarin proposed something that had never been tried in Luminari history. She wanted to establish a joint research facility, where both species could study what had happened to the three young ones. The facility would serve multiple purposes: advancing scientific understanding, developing better communication between the species, and most importantly, determining what was best for the creatures themselves. Dr. Yuna was fascinated by the proposal. The opportunity to study an advanced alien species was beyond anything she had ever hoped for. But she was also concerned about the creatures' welfare. They had been through so much already, and she did not want them to become experimental subjects. June spoke up for the first time during the meeting. His voice was quiet but firm as he asked what role he would play in any research facility. The creatures had made it clear that they needed him to remain healthy and happy. He would not agree to any arrangement that separated him from them. Elder Zarin studied the human with those large ancient eyes. Through the creatures, she asked him why he cared so much about beings that were not even his own species. June's answer was simple and direct. They were his friends, and friends took care of each other. It was as basic as that. The Luminari concept of friendship was very different from the human understanding. In their society, relationships were based on shared consciousness and group harmony. The idea of caring for someone simply because you chose to, regardless of biological or mental connections, was completely foreign to them. But Elder Zarin was old and wise enough to recognize something important when she saw it. The three young ones were not just surviving in their changed condition, they were flourishing. They had learned skills and developed capabilities that normal Luminari juveniles did not possess. Their individual personalities had given them a flexibility and creativity that their people had never seen before. After long consideration, Elder Zarin agreed to the research facility proposal with one important addition. The facility would be built on the planet where the creatures had first been found, creating a permanent outpost for both species. June would serve as the primary human liaison for the creatures, working with Dr. Yuna and other scientists to understand what had happened. The creatures themselves were asked for their opinion through careful questions that they could understand. Their response was immediate and unanimous. They wanted to stay with June, but they also wanted to learn about their own people and culture. The research facility would give them both things they needed. Preparations for the facility began immediately. Ships from both species would work together to build a base that could support long-term research. Advanced Luminari technology would be combined with human engineering to create something neither species could have built alone. But the most important part of the project would be the three creatures themselves. They would serve as bridges between the two species, helping humans and Luminari understand each other in ways that formal diplomats could never achieve. Their unique perspective, shaped by both alien instincts and human influence, would be the key to successful cooperation. As the weeks passed and construction began, the creatures continued to grow and develop in remarkable ways. They learned to switch between human and Luminari communication styles depending on who they were talking to. They could explain human concepts to their own people and translate Luminari ideas into terms that humans could understand. Most importantly, they retained their strong bond with June, while also developing relationships with other humans and Luminari. They proved that it was possible to maintain individual identity, while still being part of a larger community. This was a lesson that both species needed to learn. Dr. Yuna's research revealed that the bond between June and the creatures had created actual changes in their brain structure. New neural pathways had formed that allowed them to process emotions and relationships in ways that were completely new for their species. They had become something unprecedented, Luminari who could think and feel like individuals while still maintaining their connection to the greater consciousness of their people. The implications were staggering. If the process could be understood and controlled, It might be possible for members of both species to develop enhanced abilities through close contact with each other. The research facility would not just study what had already happened, but explore what might be possible in the future. Elder Zarin began to see the three young ones not as damaged juveniles, but as pioneers of a new form of consciousness that combined the best aspects of both species. Their rescue by a human had not ruined their development. It had opened up possibilities that neither species had ever imagined. As the facility neared completion, everyone involved realized that they were participating in something historic. The simple act of one human saving three alien creatures had led to a new model for interspecies cooperation based on genuine friendship and mutual understanding rather than formal treaties and diplomatic protocols. The three creatures had become living proof that the boundaries between different forms of consciousness were not as solid as anyone had believed. They were writing a new chapter in the story of what it meant to be intelligent life in the galaxy. 6 months after the joint research facility was completed, it had become a thriving center of interspecies cooperation that exceeded everyone's expectations. The base was built into the rocky cliffs where June had first found the creatures, creating a permanent monument to the moment that changed two civilizations forever. The facility itself was a marvel of combined technology. Luminary crystal growing techniques had been merged with human engineering to create buildings that seemed to pulse with life. The walls could adjust their transparency and temperature automatically, and the lighting systems responded to the emotional states of the occupants. June had been promoted to the new position of Xenobiological Liaison Specialist, a job title that had been created specifically for him. His lack of formal scientific training had turned out to be an advantage rather than a problem. He could interact with the Luminary without the preconceptions that might have limited more experienced researchers. The three creatures, now approaching the equivalent of teenage years in their development, had become remarkable individuals who served as living bridges between the two species. They had grown larger and more graceful, but they retained the gentle nature and curiosity that had marked them from the beginning. Hana had developed into the most vocal of the three, serving as the primary translator for complex scientific and philosophical discussions. She could switch between human speech and luminary harmonic communication so smoothly that visitors sometimes forgot they were listening to an alien being. Her individual personality had become strong and confident, but she never lost her affection for the human who had saved her life. Dal had become fascinated with technology and spent much of his time working with the facility's engineers to develop new tools that both species could use. His calm, analytical mind was perfectly suited for solving the technical challenges that arose when trying to merge two completely different approaches to science and engineering. Biol had emerged as an artist and philosopher, creating works that expressed concepts neither species had ever imagined before. Her paintings seemed to glow with inner light, and her musical compositions combined human melodies with luminary harmonics to produce sounds that moved listeners to tears. All three had retained their special connection to June, but it had evolved into something more mature and complex than the simple attachment they had shown as juveniles. They respected him as their first teacher and protector, but they also related to him as equals and friends. Their bond had become a model for the kind of relationships that were possible between different species. Dr. Yuna's research had revealed fascinating details about how the creatures' development had been affected by their early contact with humans. Their brains showed structures that did not exist in normal luminary, neural networks that allowed them to process individual emotions while still maintaining their connection to the group consciousness of their people. Even more remarkable was the discovery that prolonged contact with the creatures had begun to change human brain patterns as well. June and the other humans who worked closely with them showed increased activity in areas associated with empathy and communication. It seemed that the bonding process worked both ways, enhancing the abilities of both species. The success of the facility had attracted attention from across human space and the luminary civilization. Delegations from both species visited regularly to observe the ongoing research and to learn from the unique cooperation that had developed there. Many visitors arrived as skeptics and left as converts to the idea that interspecies friendship was not only possible but beneficial. One of the most important developments was the creation of mixed exploration teams. Human adaptability and individual initiative combined perfectly with luminary collective wisdom and advanced technology. The teams could solve problems and make discoveries that neither species could have achieved alone. The three creatures were essential members of these teams, serving not just as translators but as advisors who could help both species understand each other's strengths and limitations. Their unique perspective, shaped by both human and luminary influences, allowed them to see solutions that others missed. But perhaps the most significant discovery came from studying the emotional bonds that had formed throughout the facility. Scientists from both species found that deep personal connections between different sentient beings could actually create new forms of consciousness that were greater than the sum of their parts. The relationship between June and the three creatures had been just the beginning. As more humans and luminari worked together over extended periods, they developed their own version of the bonding process. These connections enhanced creativity, problem-solving ability, and emotional well-being for all participants. Elder Zarin, who had initially been concerned about the creature's unusual development, had become one of the strongest supporters of the research program. She spent much of her time at the facility, working to understand how the bonding process might be applied more widely in luminari society. The traditional luminari approach to consciousness, based on gradual integration into the group mind, was still valuable and important. But the individual awareness that the creatures had developed offered new possibilities for growth and adaptation that their species had never considered before. Human society was also being changed by contact with the luminari. The alien approach to collective decision-making and shared consciousness offered solutions to problems that had plagued humanity for centuries. Wars and conflicts became much harder to sustain when people could truly understand each other's perspectives. The facility had become more than a research station. It was a laboratory for developing new forms of civilization that combined the best aspects of both species. The success of the cooperation there was inspiring similar projects throughout human and luminary space. Trade agreements were signed that went far beyond simple exchanges of goods and technology. Cultural exchange programs allowed members of both species to live and work together for extended periods. Joint colonies were planned that would be built and populated by mixed communities from the beginning. The three creatures watched these developments with pride and satisfaction. They had become living symbols of what was possible when different forms of consciousness came together in friendship and mutual respect. Their rescue from a frozen cave had led to one of the most important developments in galactic history. But for June, the most important thing remained the simple fact that three small beings who had been dying in the cold were now healthy, happy, and contributing to something greater than themselves. Every day, as he watched Hana, Dal, and Buell interact with visitors from both species, he was reminded that the most profound changes often began with the simplest acts of kindness. The facility had proven that the barriers between different forms of life were not as solid as anyone had believed. Intelligence, consciousness, and the capacity for friendship existed in many forms throughout the galaxy, and when they came together, they created possibilities that no single species could achieve alone. The future promised even greater discoveries as the cooperation between humans and luminari continued to grow and develop. But the foundation for everything that followed would always be the bond between one human and three alien creatures who had found each other in the darkness and cold of a distant world. 2 years after the first rescue in the frozen cave, the Joint Research Facility had become the most important diplomatic and scientific center in known space. What had started as a simple act of human compassion had grown into a revolution that was changing the entire galaxy. June stood on the observation deck of the facility, watching as the latest group of visitors prepared to depart. They included representatives from 12 different species who had come to study the human luminary cooperation model. The success of the project had attracted attention from civilizations throughout the galaxy, all eager to learn how such different forms of consciousness could work together so effectively. Hana, Dal, and Buell had grown into their roles as interspecies ambassadors with grace and wisdom that amazed everyone who met them. They were no longer the small, frightened creatures that June had found dying in the cold. They had become pioneers of a new form of consciousness that combined individual identity with collective awareness in ways that benefited. Both Hana had just finished leading a discussion group that included philosophers from 6 different species. Her ability to translate not just words but entire ways of thinking had made her one of the most sought-after mediators in the galaxy. She could help species that had been unable to communicate for centuries find common ground and understanding. Dal had become the chief engineer for a project to build the first truly interspecies starship. The vessel would incorporate design principles from dozens of different civilizations, creating a craft that could serve as home to crew, members from species with completely different environmental and social needs. Bile's artistic works were now displayed in museums across human and luminary space. Her paintings and musical compositions expressed concepts about consciousness and connection that spoke to beings regardless of their biological origin. She had developed a new art form that could be appreciated by any intelligent species. But despite their success and recognition, the three creatures maintained their special relationship with the human who had saved them. Every evening, they would spend time together in the quarters they shared, talking about the day's events and planning for the future. Their bond had become deeper and more complex over time, evolving from simple gratitude into true friendship and mutual respect. Dr. Yuna's research had expanded far beyond the original study of the three creatures. She now led a team of scientists from multiple species who were investigating the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. Their work had revealed that intelligence and awareness existed in far more forms than anyone had previously imagined. The bonding process that had first been observed between June and the creatures was now understood to be a natural capability that many species possessed but had never learned to use. When beings from different backgrounds formed deep emotional connections, it created new neural pathways that enhanced creativity, problem-solving ability, and emotional well-being for all involved. This discovery had led to the development of programs designed to help different species form beneficial relationships. The techniques developed at the facility were being used to resolve conflicts, improve trade relations, and create new forms of cooperative government throughout the galaxy. Elder Zarin had become one of the most respected voices in the growing interspecies alliance. Her initial concerns about the creature's unusual development had been completely transformed as she saw the benefits that individual consciousness could bring to collective decision-making. The Luminari were slowly adopting new social structures that allowed for both group harmony and personal growth. Human society had also been profoundly changed by contact with the Luminari and other species. The ability to truly understand different perspectives had reduced conflicts and increased cooperation within human communities. New forms of government were being developed that incorporated both human individuality and alien collective wisdom. The facility itself had expanded far beyond its original size. What had started as a small research station was now a city that served as home to thousands of beings from dozens of different species. The architecture continued to evolve as new techniques were developed for creating living spaces that could accommodate the diverse needs of its residents. But perhaps the most important development was the change in how all the participating species thought about consciousness and identity. The old assumption that intelligence could only exist in one form had been completely disproven. The galaxy was full of different ways of thinking and feeling, and each one had something valuable to contribute to the greater understanding of life and awareness. The three creatures had become living symbols of this new understanding. They proved that consciousness was not fixed or limited by biology. Through their relationship with June and their experiences at the facility, they had developed into something that was both truly luminary and uniquely individual. They had shown that it was possible to honor one's origins while still growing beyond them. Captain O'Silky, now promoted to admiral and serving as the facility's military liaison, often reflected on how a routine rescue mission had led to such profound changes. The discovery of the creatures had been pure chance, but the decision to treat them with kindness and respect had been purely human. That choice had opened up possibilities that no one could have predicted. The success of the facility had led to plans for similar installations throughout the galaxy. Mixed communities where different species could live and work together were being established on dozens of worlds. Each one would serve as a laboratory for developing new forms of cooperation and understanding. Trade between species had evolved from simple exchanges of goods to complex partnerships, involving shared research, cultural exchange, and joint exploration of the unknown regions of space. The economic benefits were enormous, but the social and cultural gains were even more valuable. As June watched the sun set over the facility that had grown from his simple act of kindness, he was joined by Hana, Dal, and Buell. The four friends stood together in comfortable silence, looking out over the bustling community that had become their home. The creatures had long since outgrown their need for constant protection, but they still chose to spend their free time with the human who had saved them. Their relationship had become something that neither species had words to describe fully. It was friendship, family, and partnership all combined into something new and wonderful. Dr. Yuna approached the group with news of the latest research results. The bonding process was being successfully replicated between members of species that had never been able to communicate before. The techniques developed through studying June's relationship with the creatures were helping to solve conflicts and create understanding throughout the galaxy. The story of the human who saved 3 alien creatures in a frozen cave had become legend among dozens of species, but for June it remained intensely personal. Every day brought new reminders that the most important things in life often began with simple acts of compassion. As the stars appeared in the darkening sky, the four friends made plans for the next day's activities. There would be new visitors to meet, new problems to solve, and new discoveries to be made. The work of building understanding between different forms of consciousness would continue for generations to come, but the foundation for all of it would always be the bond that had formed between one human and 3 small aliens who had found each other in the darkness and cold of a distant world. Their friendship had proven that love and kindness could transcend any barrier, creating connections that made all involved stronger and wiser than they could ever be alone. The future stretched ahead, full of possibilities that no single species could achieve by itself, but that all of them together might accomplish through cooperation, understanding, and the simple recognition that consciousness came in many forms, all of them valuable and deserving of respect.